late-breaking news. Edward Ludwig did not, in fact, direct sign them papers with Hairbreadth Harry. It was Edward Luddy who later changed his name to Edward Ludwig. Okay, fine. It's the same guy. He changed his name during World War I so he didn't sound so German, and then worked as a writer and director for a number of comedies in the 20s with Larry Seaman, Monty Banks, and a number of others, and then directed some big-time feature films in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, including the 1940 Swiss Family Robinson, Wake of the Red Witch, and Big Jim McLean with John Wayne, and then The Black Scorpion, great science fiction film of the 1950s. But anyway, this is one of the Hairbreadth Harrys produced by the Weiss brothers post-West Brothers after they had broken away from the Weiss brothers. It's the third season of Hairbreadth Harrys, and you're going to see some differences, a lower budget, completely different casts, but yeah, it's still got its moments. And it has some recognizable comedians like Bud Duncan, right here, banging on the desk, the diminutive Bud Duncan. I'm going to talk more about him on the commentary for Movie Mania, but a reasonably well-known second or third string comedian of the teens and 20s. Of course, was half of the notorious comedy team of Ham and Bud with Lloyd Hamilton. But we'll see some more of him later. Now, here's beautiful Belinda, who is actually beautiful brunette Belinda this time. Now, we don't recognize her, and she's not credited, so who knows? She's an unknown of some sort, but she does an okay job in this. And you might recognize the janitor. That's Joe Young again. Yes, the brother of Robert Young, who we saw and talked about in Which Poodle's Handler Was It Better Behave, I guess, where he played the policeman. Again, he was a regular in a lot of two-reel comedies of the 20s, both at Senate, Universal, a number of places. Acted for a long time. Never had the career his brother had, but still made a decent living at it, apparently. Now, well, this is kind of a cute little bit, but like I said, you're working on a much lower budget here. You're not going to see elaborate sets. People not, falling into vats. They aren't going to be knocking cars off of Pacific Palisades or any of that sort of fun. This is pretty much your standard Weiss Brother Clarion photoplay production. You're going to be in some cheap sets, wandering around Larchmont Avenue a bit, and but still, it has some things going for it. So we'll see. The late Weiss Brother comedy shorts, and again, they were releasing them into 1930, but I think the Weisses definitely sort of dumped that last season of comedies on the market because silent pictures were definitely on the ebb. Although, again, there were still a number of small-town theaters that hadn't retooled for sound yet. And so, there were still plenty of markets, especially in the States' rights and, in the Midwest and the South, to sell silent pictures to into 1930. So the Weiss brothers were doing it. Universal was still making silent versions of their 1930 sound films. Here's Hairbreadth Harry. Again, nobody credited. Don't know who he is. He's not Earl McCarthy. Earl McCarthy has gone on to do supporting roles elsewhere. But hey, he's all right. He's probably not making a huge amount of money doing this, so probably wasn't too concerned that his name was on it or not. But anyway, listen, the Weisses, we're sort of making an attempt, to sell their silent pictures to sound houses. The last season, the 29-30 shorts, all have synchronized soundtracks with a pretty lousy orchestra, a bunch of musicians not used to playing with each other. Just knocking off some cheap, probably public domain tunes and some pretty iffy sound effects. But hey, that showed the Weisses were trying to put a little bit of production into these things, sell them somehow to someone. Now here is Relentless Rudolph, and well, it's Jimmy Aubrey, who you may or may not recognize at this point. I don't know if you haven't watched any of the Jimmy Aubrey films. Now, I said some less than kind things about him. They may be true, but they were kind in the commentary for Keep Smiling. Despite that, he does a pretty good job as Rudolph. that his sort of terrible Turk kind of performing style works pretty well for a top-hatted villain, and he still got the elongated top hat. I bet it's the same one Jack Richardson was wearing. So it kind of works for him, and he's got a nice little trick of jiggling the top hat when he's taking delight over any sort of evil that he's doing. So this film's definitely worth watching, just for Aubrey, who has found a part that pretty much works for him. But we're going to take this time to talk about somebody we haven't discussed yet, who we really should discuss in a history of the Weiss brothers, and that's the Weiss brothers. They kind of important to this, I would guess. And so, in a nutshell, here is the history of the Weiss brothers. Now, there were three: Max, Louis, and Adolf. They got into the entertainment business kind of slowly and cautiously, like the good businessmen they were. In the 1900s, they owned and operated the Welsbach Lamp and Fixture Store in New York City, and they started branching out. They started selling phonograph players, gramophones, and records, and this picked up their business rather considerably, allowed them to open additional stores in New York and in Philadelphia. In the teens, they started buying up small movie theaters in and around the New York area, which soon became a chain, both within New York City itself and New York State. And this finally became successful enough that they said, hey, why don't we make some films ourselves? So in the late teens, they got into film production. In 1919, they formed Art Class Pictures. Their first film was a feature entitled The Open Door, which was released October 12th of 1919 by Roberts & Cole Pictures, which was a pretty well-known distributing company in Hollywood at the time. And it was a murder mystery starring John P. Wade, not one of your major stars of the silent era, but apparently did pretty well. But even at this point, early in the Weiss brother history, they're still into changing their company name or forming a new production company to suit whatever the financial need was of the time, which is kind of the way they do it in Hollywood now. But when the National Film Company folded in 1919 due to the death of its president, William Parsons, who was in fact a film comedian himself, Smiling Billy Parsons, one of the few film mogul film comedians. But the Weisses bought from the ruins of the National Film Company the most valuable property that National owned, which was the sequel to National's most popular film, which was the first film version of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes. Now, the sequel, which was entitled The Return of Tarzan, was bought by the Weiss with all the rights to, the Burroughs characters. And the Weisses formed the Numa Film Corp to make this picture, which was shot in the spring of 1920 amidst the exotic jungles of Yonkers, New York, starring an ex-fireman and athlete named Gene Polar, who played Tarzan. Now, Louis Weiss sold the distribution rights to The Return of Tarzan to Samuel Goldwyn, who released it through Goldwyn Pictures Corporation as The Revenge of Tarzan. Now, this was because exhibitors were sort of concerned that The Return of Tarzan sounded like they were just bringing back the old Elmo Lincoln film. Now, the Weisses netted $100,000 up front on this sale and a profit percentage, and basically this was the financial foundation of the Weiss movie empire. The Weiss brothers then co-produced with the Stern brothers, who you've heard me mention. They were also silent comedy producers in the teens and 20s for Universal. But the Weiss brothers produced with them 2 serials in 1920, starring the guy who had played Tarzan for National, Elmo Lincoln. These 2 serials, Elmo the Fearless and The Flaming Disc, were both sold to Universal, who released them in 1920. They both made money. The Weisses also produced a comedy feature in 1920 called It Might Happen to You, which was states-righted through a company called S&E Enterprises. So, by and large, it was a very successful first year of film production for the brothers Weiss. Now, Numa Pictures' contract with Edgar Rice Burroughs allowed them to make a second Tarzan picture. And since they had already worked with Elmo Lincoln successfully, it seemed a no-brainer for Numa Pictures to announce in 1921 The Adventures of Tarzan, starring Elmo Lincoln, a 15-chapter serial returning Elmo Lincoln to the role that had made him famous. And this serial made another huge packet of money for the Weisses, and because of it, they decided to shoot the works, go into full-time film production. Art Class Pictures, Inc. opened offices in 1922 at 1540 Broadway, New York City. Adolph Weiss was the president. Louis Weiss was their primary producer. Art Class remained the distribution arm, and the Weisses formed a company called Clarion Photoplays, Inc. to be their producing arm. Now, it didn't start off spectacularly, apart from a couple little features in 22, like The Woman Who Believed, which was a drama of society and the African jungle. Sounds like Tarzan again. Starring Walter Miller, who would work with them again later in some serials, and Ann Luther. Now, the other kind of part of the business the Weisses got into, they started buying the rights to some foreign films, some foreign imports, most notably Fritz Lang's 1921 picture Destiny, which the Weisses released in the States in 1923, retitled Between Two Worlds. They also bought a couple of European religious epics. First off, the German-produced The Fall of Jerusalem, and then also the 52-reel Italian epic La Bibbia, which had been directed by Armando Vey and Piero Antonio Gariazzo, that covered in 52 friggin' reels the whole Old Testament. Now, 52 reels, way too long for American release. The Weisses cut La Bibbia down to 10 reels, retitled it After 6 Days, released it to theaters, churches, non-theatrical. They made money off this picture for decades. They reissued it in sound with music and narration in 1930. They took all the reels they'd cut out, the other 42 reels of the picture, turned them into one reel, single versions with, just the specific stories of the Old Testament. They released that in 16 millimeters to home markets and churches. They were making money off this picture into the 1950s. One of the probably best deals they ever made. Now, Art Class also found greater success distributing Lester F. Scott's action pictures. Now, these were low-budget B-Westerns starring a trio of B-movie cowboys, Buddy Roosevelt, Buffalo Bill Jr., and Wally Wales. Now, these Westerns were Art Class's bread and butter from 1924 to pretty close to the end of the silent era. And many of them featured a young actress by the name of Jean Arthur playing the leading lady, who, of course, is the same Jean Arthur who was in Frank Capra pictures and was the big star in the 30s and 40s. Now, around 1924, Art Class began releasing a number of short subjects. Now, they were, again, picking up some European imports, including the British-produced series Tense Moments with Great Authors, and Tense Moments from Great Plays, both one-reel run-throughs of public domain stories like A Christmas Carol and Hunchback of Notre Dame, produced on no budgets at all. Again, you'll see some of those in our extras. They also had a series of sing-along cartoons. They were making safety defense training films. They were doing all sorts of stuff. The Weiss brothers got into the short comedy business around 1926, again when they signed Snub Pollard and the West brothers to produce comedies for them. Both of those people got into financial difficulties, so when Snub Pollard and the West brothers, closed out, Clarion Photoplays picked up the slack and continued producing two-reel comedies. The Weisses were also making serials again in the late 20s. They made one in 1927, Perils of the Jungle. They made two in 28, The Mysterious Airman and The Police Reporter, both starring Walter Miller again. And the Art Class continued distributing, as I said, the silent short comedies into 1930. But when talkies came in, wanting to stay ahead of the game, the Weisses retooled for talkies. And they made their first talkie feature in 1929, Unmasked, featuring Arthur B. Reeves' scientific detective character, Craig Kennedy. This is a character they bought the rights to, and by God, they'd use it forever. Into television into the 50s when they had a Craig Kennedy detective TV series. Now, art class produced a number of talkie features in the first years of sound using, believe it or not, the DeForest phonofilm process, because Louis Weiss had taken over management of the Phonophone studios in DeForest, New York in the late 20s when Lee DeForest was starting to have financial problems. So they used the process. Some of the early art class features included Made to Order, 1930, starring female impersonator Julian Eltinge, who always looked like a dock worker in a dress. I don't know why that act worked. I guess it worked from the stage. It never worked on film. A fun one called Nightlife in Reno, which starred Virginia Valley, Dixie Lee was Mrs. Bing Crosby, and believe it or not, comedy fans, a sober Arthur Houseman playing a villain. And my other favorite from 1931, probably the worst early talkie horror film ever made, The Phantom, featuring Gwyn Big Boy Williams, Aileen Ray, and Sheldon Lewis as the Thing. It's awful. It really is awful. But hey, that's what happened. Weiss Brothers art class folded in 1931 because of the Depression, basically, after making a handful of actually pretty good Harry Carey westerns. Sadly, that were some of the better talkie features art class had produced. Now, not to be, undaunted, Louis Weiss returned to the film business in 1933, reformed art class as Stage and Screen Productions, and they were also sort of tied in with a company called Superior Talking Pictures Corp. But Stage and Screen produced one feature released in 1933, Before Morning, which starred Leo Carrillo, murder mystery. I think they made some westerns for Superior, and they made 3 low-budget serials in 1936. There's Joe Young playing a cop, standing on Larchmont again. But 3 low-budget serials, again, 1936, The Black Coin, The Clutching Hand, and Custer's is a comedy. Custer's Last Stand, all made on a budget of $10,000 or less. And they featured a bevy of former silent stars like Rex Leese, Jack Mulhall, Ralph Graves, and even Snub Pollard, who appears in The Black Coin. And The Clutching Hand is another Craig Kennedy mystery. Now, these must have made some money because Louis Weiss also produced, at the time, several serials for Columbia Pictures in the late 30s. Jungle Menace and The Mysterious Pilot, 1937. The Secret of Treasure Island, 1938. Now, World War II pretty much stopped Louis Weiss's producing, but his son, Adrian Weiss, who had worked on the serial Stage and Screen and produced in the 30s, he continued to work in film production. During the war, he was an editor at Fort Roach, the Hal Roach Studios, producing war training films. And Adrian and Lewis got back into feature films after the war, producing a wonderful, awful thing called White Gorilla in 1945, using a lot of clips from their silent serial Perils of the Jungle. They also got into television, distributing all their old product television as early as 1947. They produced a series, Craig Kennedy Criminologist. Then things started to get quieter. Adrian Weiss did produce the infamous Ed Wood classic Bride and the Beast in 1958 and continued to operate Weiss Global International, distributing a lot of the old Weiss product, stuff from other producers like William Pizer. They bought Robert Lippard's product from the 50s. Literally, they were selling the stuff into the 1980s. One show you may remember from the 60s was The Chuckleheads, which cut the Weiss Brother comedy two-reelers into 6-minute segments. That's basically why you can still find, middle-aged people who remember who Poodles Hannaford is because they saw him on kid shows in the 1960s. So that's pretty much the history of the Weiss Brothers. And for a company that should have been probably more fly-by-night than it was, the Weisses actually outlived a number of major studios and remained a family business for 6 decades. So say what you will, the Weisses have survived, and so have their films. If there was a way to make a buck off them 20, 30 years later, they were still doing it. And that's why we're looking at them today.